The Italian Renaissance. It was a topic most of us had kind of drilled into our brains back in grade school, I'm sure. Renaissance, as most of you probably know, means rebirth. Well, that's fine and dandy, but kind of on the same token as the Crusades, the real meaning is kind of passed over. So before we get into the people of the era, as well as the minute details, I think we need to wind back the clock a little bit. No, further back. You can do better than that. Okay, there we go. Yes, we're going back to the 1st century AD. The main topic of interest, of course, is the Roman Empire. Rome was expanding its territories over time, and although it was very successful at this, it would later come back to haunt them amid other issues. Now, in the final century BC, Rome had snagged up a ton of land following some pretty successful offensives. Just to name a few major events, you had the Spanish Wars, the Alpine, Danubian, and German campaigns. Egypt was undergoing civil war at this time, and later on it was annexed. After this finished, Rome entered a period known as Pax Romana, which translates to Roman peace. It was about as close as Rome got to a long period of peace, and the military remained relatively constant in size and wasn't heavily utilized. Between 15 and 60 AD, or rather across the reigns of Tiberius through Nero, you saw more territorial annexations, most notably along North Africa, Britain, and the Levant. By 116 AD, nearing the end of Emperor Trajan's rule, Rome was at the largest extent it would reach. Although there was minor expansion further into Britain over this time, the pushes into Germania and the Levant were pretty impressive. However, across the next year, they lost Assyria, Mesopotamia, and Armenia once again, as well as eastern and western Dacia. However, it maintained more or less the same size for the next 80 years or so. There were some cases of smaller territories gained or lost, but it was kind of about the same. You might think that these expansions I mentioned break the whole rule and thought process of Pax Romana, which was an era of peace, but historians recognize this, and the only points where these expansions occurred were under Claudius and Trajan's rule, and just from what I could suss out, they just kind of hold those two as anomalies, because for the most part the rulers were very restrained in their use of military. In 180 AD, Emperor Marcus Aurelius passed away. Aurelius's death is where historians typically say you can mark the end of Pax Romana. After his death, Aurelius's son, Commodus, became emperor. Having no military or political experience under his belt, Commodus wasn't exactly the best choice. Of course, we won't begin to get into his full name. Going further, he was incredibly vain. I mean, the dude had tons of statues made of himself. Some involved him dressing up as heroes like Hercules, which is probably the origin of his 6th first name, so to speak. He was said to have also been an attractive fella for the age and was particularly fit for a finger pointer, so to speak. He also had a habit of encouraging and even taking part in gladiator matches. The matches he took part in, of course, were almost rigged. The combatants he faced almost always submitted themselves from the get-go because, well, he was the freaking emperor. Of course, he'd let them live most of the time just to, appear as a good guy, and later on it was said that he killed most of them in private just for shits and giggles. To make the audience side with him more, he'd typically be in the real snazzy, royal battle gear, and his opponents would be in animal skins or hardly dressed at all. In fact, there were some cases where the opponent was said to have been nude. He also charged pretty ridiculous amounts of money for each of these arena appearances, or PR stunts, so to speak. And these amounts were enough to where it would really damage the local economy. What does this have to do with things? Well, you might kind of wonder at one point, where did these combatants come from that he used? You had slaves to pick from, sure, but those guys were of some use elsewhere. Alternatives? Well, you had wounded and amputated citizens and soldiers who were often plucked. People who were dying from disease or simply vagrants were also yanked into the arena, only for Commodus to beat them and supposedly kill a lot of them afterward. And we won't even get into his weird love of killing exotic animals in front of the crowds. In one instance that was seen as a straw that broke the camel's back, he ended up decapitating an ostrich. Once again, don't ask. And he held it up as a threat in front of the nearby senators. By this point, enough was enough. Commodus was, he was pretty crazy, useless, troublesome, and he needed to be taken out. The plan? Well, let's just poison his food. Well, for some strange reason, he ate the food and later threw it up, somehow realizing it was poisoned. Later on, though, he was successfully killed when he was strangled while bathing. For such a vain fella, I find it kind of funny the man who strangled him was named Narcissus. Oh, Narcissus was his wrestling buddy, so basically his personal trainer killed him. So the terrible emperor was dead. What now? Well, name the next one, Rome goes on, happy, hunky-dory, everything's great, and whoa, there's a tiny problem. Thing is, he was dead, but there wasn't a line to the throne per se. It was more so like a crowd huddled around it. This led to 193 AD, which is also known as the Year of 5 Emperors. There is no hidden gag or anything, it's exactly what it sounds like. The man who cooked up the assassination, the city prefect known as Pertinax, was crowned. He was later assassinated not too long thereafter. Basically, rinse and repeat that thing a few times, and you arrive at Septimius Severus, who maintained the title of emperor until he died in 211. And there was another chain of successors. Now, Septimius Severus made several stupid mistakes that would come back to haunt Rome, but we'll get into that in the next segment, trust me. Let's skip ahead to the next key part. The emperor in 222, Severus Alexander. As I mentioned earlier, Rome was very, very successful at this point. Though not as large as it was under Trajan, it was still pretty massive. When you grow larger, that means you have to spread out more. It also means that the borders in many places grew even larger. It was around this time the barbarian tribes began to achieve some good success against the thin-spread Romans. To the east, near Mesopotamia, or the cradle of civilization, the Parthian Empire collapsed. What replaced this formidable opponent soon became something far more frightening to the Romans, the Sassanid Empire. Within a few years, the Sassanids launched a series of successful offensives against Rome's eastern front. Faced with the booming rise of the hostile Sassanids, compounded with the recent success of the barbarian invaders, Alexander did poorly, to put it lightly. At one point, he was said to have actually tried to bribe the barbarians so they would ease up for a while. The military, of course, did not approve of this approach in the slightest. Records, albeit with potential bias, state that Alexander wanted to basically have a nice, easy time as emperor, and he just wanted to ignore these hostile situations entirely if possible. But the thing is, they needed to be addressed and competently. The military was once again fed up with the emperor and decided to choose a new leader. This fellow was named Gaius Iulius versus Maximinus. The military assassinated Alexander and placed Maximinus as the emperor. This marked the start of the crisis of the 3rd century.